Night softens to dawn as we follow the Azurelode River through the Hillsbrad Foothills, past Thoradin's wall, Southshore's quiet piers, and Tarren Mill's worn lanes. We'll climb to Durnholde's ruins, circle Lordamere Lake, and stand at Dungarroch's ramparts. Walk softly. This land remembers every step. You begin at the edge of the Hillsbrad Foothills, where the road slips out of a shallow wood and the world opens into long, folding meadows. And the first thing you notice is how the wind here seems to carry two scents at once. The resin of pine from the slopes above, and the salt of the distant sea to the south. The path underfoot is a scatter of pale stones pressed into the earth by centuries of hooves and carts, and as you step forward, your footfalls are answered by the quiet murmur of the Azurelode River somewhere ahead. It feels like a place that taught itself to speak softly, even when history tried to make it shout, and that softness eases your breathing and slows your eyes to the pace of the grass. Looking left, you catch the ragged line of a stone fence that wanders up a hill and disappears into bracken, a reminder that farmers once trusted this boundary with their livelihoods and their sleep. To the right, birches flash white among the darker firs, slim and patient the way time is patient when it lives in trees, and a watchtower pricks the ridgeline like a note pinned to the sky. Above it all, the clouds drift without hurry, and the light is the color of unpolished brass, and the day feels older than it is. The land welcomes you, not with trumpets or drums, but with permission, and permission is the best welcome of all. You walk until the road rises and bends towards stonework that seems to cut the horizon itself, and Thoradin's wall emerges from the land with the gravity of an oath kept for too long. The closer you come, the more you taste the chalk of ancient mortar in the air, and each block shows the wisdom of the masons who set it. 1,000 small alignments that, together, made a line kingdoms trusted. It is not a wall that shouts, it murmurs, and the murmur sounds like history saying, "Once we believed in borders more than in people." Archways frame little rectangles of landscape, heather, fence, a rabbit still enough to be a statue, and the wind moves through the arrow slits like a recorder playing a single, thoughtful note. A fox slips through a gap where soldiers once stood, and for a heartbeat the animal's amber eye meets yours, and you feel how all the grand designs of kings eventually become corridors for quieter intentions. You lay a hand on the stone, and it holds the cool of shadow like a promise. Beneath your palm you imagine the ring of hammers, the thud of scaffolds, the calloused grip of labor that rarely gets its stories told. When you step back, the wall keeps its counsel, and that, too, feels like part of its design. The Azurelode River appears when the road folds downward, a ribbon of silver braided with sky, and you choose to follow its bank because rivers are the first historians of any land. Pebbles click and roll under water that carries yesterday without bitterness, and reeds bow in agreement as if to say that time is not a straight line, but a patient curve. A wooden bridge waits for you with planks worn by more feet than anyone could count, and when you cross, you hear the sound of the river talking to the beams, a hush and a knock like polite conversation. You imagine carts creaking here with sacks of grain, barrels of salt fish bound for Southshore, children urging each other to run and leap and pretend they are heroes crossing into legend. A dragonfly skims the surface, sewing together two reflections that the breeze tries to pull apart, and the day grows warmer by a degree you cannot measure but can feel behind your eyes. Downstream, the water wheel of a mill turns with the slow satisfaction of a task understood, dripping a second language of droplets, and the smell of wet wood and good work gathers in your lungs like a blessing. You follow that smell, because blessings are paths too. The road broadens as it nears Southshore's old waterfront, and even in ruin the town still holds the shape of bustle. The terraces of stone, the piers reaching into gentle swells, the bones of market stalls around a square that remembers trades and quarrels, and the laughter that lasts longer than both. You slow your steps and let the story of the place retell itself in full sentences. Fishermen returning at dawn, nets slung like sails over shoulders, bakers sliding loaves onto wooden racks, clerks tallying the day while the ink dries with a faint, salty tang. Lamps would have painted gold ladders on the harbour at dusk, and the wind would have been full of gossip and gulls, and ships from Cool Tiras would have nodded against moorings like patient oxen, their ropes creaking in time with the tide. You picture spices from distant ports, news carried faster than any rider could manage, and the familiar friction between people who have lived a long time together and love each other enough to argue. Children would have raced the length of the quay and back, declaring themselves captains and corsairs, and sometimes shopkeepers if the afternoon demanded realism. Even now, when boards splinter and timbers slump, the place seems to wait for common miracles. A fair catch, a fair price, a fair weather morning, and you honour that by standing still long enough to listen. The breeze tastes like memory rinsed in brine, and you step on with gratitude that you arrived in time to hear it. Tarren Mill greets you with the architecture of effort, low buildings trimmed in wood darkened by steam and rain, yards stacked with barrels and hides, rooftops that hold the dignity of honest, unglamorous craft. Once, this was a town that made other people's journeys possible, and you can still imagine the rhythm of mallets tapping tacks into boots, the scrape of knives dressing leather, the steady creak of a wheel that lifts water like a patient heart. Doors hang a little crooked now, but windows still catch the sun in shards of clarity, and the air keeps the smell of tannin and oil and stiff brushes, and you realize that a town can be a tool, and a tool can be beautiful because it works. In a side yard, a bench holds stitching awls and thread beside a half-finished satchel, and the sight of it narrows the years between then and now until you could reach across the gap and pull the piece into your lap. You hear the easy talk of neighbours who borrow and lend more than things, who measure wealth in 1,000 small reliances, and the thought steadies you as surely as a hand on your shoulder. Crossing the main lane, you imagine bells marking meal times and shifts, and a dog dozing under the eaves with one ear consented to duty. Tarren Mill, like all places that build rather than break, teaches you how to breathe again. Northwest, where the land leans into harsher air, Darrow Hill rises with a defiance that is really endurance, and the wind that lives there knows the names of the stones. You climb the path where fences lean like tired friends, and the chimneys of abandoned cottages point toward stories you will never fully recover. But you try anyway, because you have learned that trying is sometimes the most faithful form of remembrance. Thistles keep counsel with the doorstep. A kettle rusts where a window used to be. An old apple tree still attempts to throw a spring halo of blossom against the odds and the deer. and that effort is a sermon without a preacher. From the crest, you see the sweep of the foothills, turning like a page, and the line of Thoradin's wall threads the eastern horizon, while the Alterac mountains shoulder the north with the authority of weather. A raven clocks across the sky with deliberate wing beats, and you know in your ribs that power is not always loud, and grief is not always final. The wind draws tears from your eyes without asking what they are for, and you accept the bargain because it feels like payment for the view. When you descend, you leave your worry on the gatepost like a hat you might not need again. You feel the shift the way a horse feels thunder before the rider hears it. The softness tightens, the horizon grows a new edge, and the road dust tastes like a prelude to smoke. History teaches itself into the landscape with event and echo, and you hear in the wind the remembered drums of the old horde beating a pace the land did not agree to. Orcish raiders surged through these valleys with a confidence learned on other worlds, and the first farms to fall gave the rest no time to hold the fence. By the time shutters banged and herds were unloosed to block the lanes, fire was already arguing with timber across the breadth of the district. Southshore closed itself like a fist, and Tarren Mill hammered shields in the rain, and the Alliance, newborn, uncertain, necessary, pulled iron from every corner of Lordaeron to harden this gentle place. You can almost see the line of knights at the turn of the road where the hedges bow away, their destriers fretting and nostrils rimed with sweat, and you can absolutely feel the fear in the hands that tightened reins and asked them not to show it. It was not a war that asked permission, but still, people here tried to answer it with devotion and memory, and the resolve not to lose their ordinary life to extraordinary appetite. The first ash fell like grey snow and stuck to everyone for weeks. Down by the harbour, the fight was as much water as flame, with catapult stones shouldering into the shingles and ships scuttled by their own crews to deny the raiders, and the cries that rose off the quay braided themselves into a song of stubbornness louder than fear. Mage fire made the night bright as treason. Arrows erased themselves in wet thumps, and through all of it, the bell of the lighthouse kept time, a metronome that insisted there would be another hour and another after that. You walk the pier and place your palm on a piling that has outlived several kinds of dread, and you imagine a commander counting broken spears and notches on courage rather than lives, because sometimes numbers are the only way to stand up. Southshore did not break at once. It bowed and then held, and while it held, fishermen became quartermasters, and bakers became medics, and the bone-white line of the surf learned new meanings for the word line. The sea sprayed salt across chainmail and soaked bandages and bread alike, reminding everyone that every battle is fought in the midst of ordinary tasks, and that the mundane is a more faithful witness than any banner. When the assault slackened, people slept where they stood, and the harbour slept with them, because endurance after chaos is a shared craft. You pause and give the place a quiet, earned nod before moving on. The road to Durnholde Keep rises into a posture of vigilance, and even in ruin the fortress holds its shoulders square, as if one more watch would be a small favour. Here, the old horde came under Orgrim Doomhammer's banner to pry Zul'jin out of human chains and return him to a war that would tally many costs, and you can feel in the stones the jolt of ladders, the groan of doors, the world leaning toward a hinge. You trace a hole in the wall where a ram once spoke, and you see the zigzag scorch where oil tried to teach the lesson of height to those climbing anyway, and your throat tightens with respect for both sides, the ones who defended with the tools at hand, and the ones who risked everything for fidelity to their own. The night they won Zul'jin back, the air would have tasted like iron and victory, and a kind of sorrow that triumph does not cure. Because victory against someone else is not the same as victory over hunger, or winter, or grief. Durnholde remembers, because stone is a better book than paper, and in its memory you can hear the low drum of consequence that beats after every battle, long after the banners are folded and the chants die. Cut grass grows back, burned beams do too, but choices write themselves into bone. You leave the keep and carry its lesson like a coin you intend to spend wisely. Within Durnholde's cells, the story narrows to a single life, and you follow it because single lives are where history chooses its doors. Thrall grew up here under the instruction of a captor who mistook control for care and saw in a child the shape of a weapon. In that mistake, the world was wounded, and in Thrall's refusal to remain what he was told to be, the world began to heal. You can almost hear the ring of practice in the yard, the hiss of breath through clenched teeth, the low, private conversation Thrall kept with the elements when the night grew quiet enough to trust. The cells remember the cadence of footsteps that would not learn despair, and the corridor knows exactly where a young hand reached for a young hope and found it substantial. Names gather weight by what we do beneath them, and the name Thrall became heavier than the chains that tried to define it. Even the walls seemed to lean to listen, as a story uncoiled from a story that had been forced too tight. Looking into the dark of a barred window, you see your own face returned with the softness of a stranger who believes in you on sight. The keep cannot instruct you more clearly than that. There is a place in the sands beneath Tanaris where time loops itself into kindness and lets us revisit the hinge moments not to meddle with them, but to learn. And old Hillsbrad is one of those loops, a lantern held up inside memory. In that dungeon's corridors, you can walk alongside a younger Thrall, feel the urgency that snaps like a wet rope, and witness the precise angles by which a prison becomes a route becomes a flight, and a flight becomes a migration of a people.
Did you? You and your allies shall answer to Blackmoor, after I've had my fun.
The Caverns of Time are not a morality play. They are an anatomy lab for destiny. And as you recall that feeling while standing here in the real Hillsbrad air, you sense your own life laying out its ladders and turns with more clarity than before.
Who or what was that?
Aretha's life hangs in the balance. Surely you care for her. Surely you wish.
The torches of old Hillsbrad sputter in imagination as the real wind combs the grass around your knees, and the two sensations cross like tracers, illuminating the difference between history as spectacle and history as responsibility.
Confrontation was inevitable. Your future, Thrall, must not come to pass. And soon. You and your troublesome...
You understand that watching a hero is not the same as learning the courage to be gentle, and that freedom is a skill that must be practiced after it is won. When you blink, Tanaris is far away, and this hillside is sharpened again, and the lesson has come home with you quietly. The caverns close their loop and ask nothing in return except your attention. Down at the Southshore wharf, Thrall and his allies once took to the sea under stolen sails, and the night of their departure would have smelled like tar and tides, and the kind of fear that is almost joy. You stand where the planks once shivered under that weight of decision, and you can feel the keel of a future sliding into water, the hush before oars bite, the sigh a harbor makes when it lets someone go. The West was not a certain salvation, only a direction, and directions are sometimes the bravest things we have. Thrall took the one available, and in doing so widened every road that would follow. You picture figures bent over ropes, shadows tugged from lanterns, a hand lingering on a post, because leaving is always two acts, the going and the touch that must precede it. When the sails finally bellied and the water took the hull, the sound would have been intimate as breath, and the town would have slept without knowing how different its morning had just become. You turn away from the water with the quiet resolve of someone who has watched a door open and did not insist on stepping through. Some doors are for others, and your job is to witness them well. When the scourge cracked Lordaeron and all the certainties inside it, the foothills absorbed a new sort of night, and Tarren Mill's roof lines learned to hold the color of a storm that never quite broke. The Forsaken came with apothecaries who worked by the logic of glass and bitterness, and where there had been vats of dye there were now retorts and alembics, and the lights that had once shone for comfort shone for secrecy. You walk between buildings and think of chemistry recited without poetry, of formulas disguised as absolution, and you feel how quickly usefulness can be pressed into cruelty if no one remains to ask the second question. The barrels here might once have held brine and now hold something that hisses against the iron rim, and your stomach tightens at the sound, because hissing is what kindness does when you heat it too far. The town did not transform all at once. A place resists, and the smell of bread and leather must have mixed with the smell of solvent and fear for a long time before one overran the other. You pick up a scrap of cloth from the dust, and it leaves a stain on your fingers you cannot name, and the sky looks away, and you understand why the word forsaken is not merely a faction, but a condition. You let the cloth fall and keep walking, because to stop here would be to learn the wrong lesson. North of Tarren Mill, the land sours and softens into the sludge fields, where the ground remembers every secret it was forced to swallow and has grown heavy with them. The air smells like a book that has been shut too long in a damp chest, and the fences here lean as if no one is allowed to stand upright, and you find yourself shortening your breath as if to take up less space. It is a place of experiment, and the word in this context means the handling of bodies, as if they are puzzles that owe you their solution, and you walk through it the way you walk through a dream you hope will not become your memory. Somewhere a chain rattles against a post, not because it has been moved, but because metal forgets slowly, and the sound draws a line across your skin like a cold finger. You see where cages once scarred the grass, and where footpaths have not yet forgiven the weight, and you hope the wind that crosses this field is the first step in a long, patient healing the land will undertake whether anyone asks forgiveness or not. You do not touch the fence, you touch your chest, and you take 3 even breaths for anyone who once could not. When you leave the sludge fields, you do not look back, and the place is grateful for that. Grief in places like this is granular, and you pick up a small stone and set it on a windowsill, because rituals are how the living keep their balance at the edge of erasure. The sea keeps holding and letting go, writing the lesson again and again. When you turn inland, you carry that rhythm in your bones. Southshore's final collapse did not happen in a single bell's ring. It was a series of nights where water tasted wrong, mornings where hands shook for no good reason, afternoons where a cough would not leave, and faces looked grey where they should have been freckled by sun. The plague was a quiet thief until it wasn't. and when it declared itself, the town had already been stripped of the strengths that would have let it stand, and the harbor that had promised comings and goings became an exit with no return. You walk the lanes where markets once argued price and value, and you feel in the walls the way a place tries to defend its people by staying itself as long as possible, and then fails the way anything fails when the rules are changed by a chemistry no one consented to. The ruin does not dramatize itself. Beams are beams, fallen where they fell, shutters hang where they hung. A child's chalk line circles a game no one finished, and that line is harder to look at than the broken roof. North of the foothills, the mountains of Alterac stand like a verdict, and the wind that pours off their broken crown has sharpened itself on betrayal for a generation. You climb a path where frost persists in the teeth of rock, even on forgiving afternoons, and the sky takes on the color of steel that remembers thunder. Alterac's fall seeded 100 small desperations that grew into the Syndicate, and the ruins scattered across these passes hold stories of noble names that traded safety for advantage, and then found they had neither. You look into a deserted courtyard where a banner must have hung, and you can see the absence as if it were a physical shape, a shadow with a seam down the middle. In an upper room, a chair lies on its back with one leg missing, and the sight is more eloquent than any chronicle about the end of a household. The wind rehearses old arguments in the archways and then dismisses them with a shrug of snow. When you descend, the foothills feel warmer, not because the air has changed, but because loyalty does. In the shallow canyons that feed out of the mountains, you find tracks that once carried more secrecy than grain, and the corners of rock keep the scent of cold smoke like an afterthought. The Syndicate learned this country the way the river knows a stone, and somewhere behind a stacked wall, a campfire would have guttered as coins changed hands and maps unfolded like conspiracies. You pause where two paths braid and imagine the calculus made by people who had lost the state but not their appetite, the weighing of risk against hunger, the barter of favors against futures. In your mind's ear, you hear the muted call and response of lookouts who never said more than they had to, and a sudden clatter that always meant run. The foothills, even in their gentleness, will accommodate any story we ask them to carry, and this, too, is part of their history. The lean seasons of people who could not return to what they had been and could not quite invent what they needed to be next. You step off the contraband road like a guest who has wandered into a private room and realized the mistake. The ordinary path feels clean as water afterward. Offshore, Purgation Isle holds its breath between tide and sky, and you stand on the headland to look at it because some places must be read from a distance or they blur. The island's chapel bones shine silver where salt has handled them for years, and graves lean in the stiff wind as if listening for news they know will not arrive. Waves write and erase names on the stones all day, and gulls argue theology no more and no less convincingly than men ever did. The ocean is indifferent to both sermons and sins, but it remembers everything. You let the horizon steady your eyes the way a straight edge steadies a hand, and your mind opens like a shutter to the breathing of the tide. Purgation is not the same as forgetting, you realize. It is the practice of letting the sea carry what you can no longer say, and allowing the wind to reply with something larger than language. When you turn back toward the foothills, you feel lighter, not because anything changed on the island, but because you have agreed not to insist. Sometimes the kindest thing a traveler can do is to keep walking. Between the two towns, the lane runs like a nerve, and in the earliest days of adventuring, it carried more electricity than any wire. because it was the corridor where Horde and Alliance learned each other's names by shouting them. You slow as you walk here, not out of fear, but reverence, and you can almost see the weekend armies boiling out of both sides with banners that mattered mostly because hands needed something to hold. There were no objectives at first beyond the one the road itself supplied: to stand, to advance, to meet, to fall, to rise, to try again. Mages turned the ditch into a sculpture of frost. Rogues wrote punctuation marks in the margins and vanished. Priests pulled the fallen back from the edge with a word, and the air itself took on the taste of adrenaline and laughter. The fights were beautiful in their chaos because they were uncommodified, and the memory of them has aged the way unvarnished wood does, glowing without polish. You pass a milestone with its numbers washed away and decide that it deserves a salute, and you give it one, a nod from the neck, a thank you from the heart. If stones could blush, this one would. Some afternoons the fight swelled so far beyond the road that the fields themselves looked like surf. Rows of bodies and colors surging and retreating until the hillocks were islands and the ditches were channels, and southbound geese revised their plans and rose on a higher wind. You imagine archers kneeling and rising to a rhythm older than drums, hunters' traps planting uncertainty in grass, and someone, always someone, deciding to hold the center where there is no shelter because a line is not a line if no one stands in it. Warlocks unspooled fear in purple ribbons, shamans threw their thunder into the balance, paladins hammered light where it would be seen by the most people, and druids negotiated with the very idea of shape. To walk this same ground now and hear only larks is to be told two truths at once: that everything passes and that nothing is ever lost. You blink, and the lark's song grows closer, as if to say that peace is also a spectacle worth gathering to witness. You promise yourself to return here sometime simply to listen. The road approves and says nothing. In later years, when nostalgia became a project rather than an accident, the clashes were reenacted in their own living museum, and players came to learn what their older cousins meant when they sighed at the word Hillsbrad. Reenactment is not repeating, it is translating, and the road understood that, allowing a new generation to discover the joy of disorganized purpose and the sweetness of victory without prizes. You picture guild chat turning conspiratorial at sunset, old men and women of 25 explaining to teenagers how to hold the tree line and why you never chase a retreating rogue, and you smile because certain kinds of wisdom deserve to be passed along with the same care we pass bread. The hills have learned to hold these nested times without flinching, and you feel no friction as you walk between them, the way a library moves from shelf to shelf with the simple act of looking. The sun slides slowly west, giving the world the kind of light painters cannot teach, and the road glows as if polished by many boots. You are not the first to bless it with attention, and you will not be the last. This knowledge makes your solitude feel companioned. Here, weather is not a mood swing, but a chapter book, and as you drift off the main road, the Hillsbrad fields spread like a quiet paragraph in the center of the page, neat rows of earth that remember both harvest songs and the clatter of armor. Morning lifts mist from the stubble the way a careful hand lifts a veil, and by the time you reach Nethander's stead, the sun has already warmed the fence rails and set the dew climbing the timbers like 1,000 tiny lanterns. The stead does not brag about surviving. Its barns and kitchen gardens simply resume their sentences where history forced a pause, and the lowing from the pen sounds like punctuation that refuses to be erased. Noon lays a warm palm across the lanes. Bees describe their steady geometry over clover heads. and the fields breathe as one, reminding you that patience is a craft and not a mood. Later, a hush of rain writes thin, even lines through the grain and along the stone walls, slicking the gate latches and the wagon tongue. And in that small gloss, the stead looks dressed for company, as if expecting old friends who finally learned the path back home. When the shower moves east, the air tastes rinsed of its troubles. The chickens shake themselves like bells, and a child's laugh lifts from the porch with such ordinary courage that you find your shoulders lowering without your permission. Evening glows along the hedges. The staves of a half-mended barrel wink in the fading light, and the Hillsbrad fields settle into their rightful grammar again: subject, verb, harvest, while you keep walking with the gentleness the land has just taught you. As the day matures, you angle north until the shoreline of Lordamere Lake unfolds in a long silver breath, and the water takes your reflection without commentary, the way a good listener receives a story and leaves it better than they found it. Out on the mirror-flat surface, grebes trawl in soft chevrons, while a heron lifts like a phrase revised mid-sentence, and somewhere beneath the lily pads, a pike considers the shape of hunger and decides on patience instead. From the low bluff, you can see the distant scar where Dalaran crater halos the horizon, a reminder that even the sky can be edited by the ambitions of mages. Yet here at the lapping verge, cattails stand their green watch, as if restoration were the lake's oldest spell. Footpaths braid along the reeds where Hillsbrad stags step light as commas between thoughts. Fox kits tumble out of a den with the anxious confidence of apprentices, and a hawk scrawls one clean underline of shadow across the beach and is gone. Your body, which all morning was a machine of intention, becomes instead a receiver of politely offered invitations. Sit on this sun-warmed rock, drink from the canteen, match your breathing to the small, disciplined waves that write and erase the shore. The wind carries a trace of ozone from far-off weather, the kind that raises geese to a higher lane, but leaves the lake untroubled, and you realize that not all warnings are alarms. Some are simply reminders to keep your balance. When you finally rise, the pebble you were turning in your fingers has dried into a faint, speckled gleam, and you pocket it the way you pocket a lesson you are not done learning. By late afternoon, the track bends through a stand of fir and spills you into the yard outside Azurelode mine, where the scaffolds and hoists creak with the honest diction of tools that have never learned to lie. The timbers smell of wet pitch and iron filings, carts sit on their rails like horses paused between hills, and the foreman's board, chalked with tidy columns of shifts and safety marks, looks less like accounting than a promise to bring everyone home. Down the adit, lanterns hang in measured intervals, halos nested like parentheses around seams that once bought bread for dozens of tables, and the water trough beside the mouth keeps its own small weather, beading the lip with a constant, meditative drip. When you leave the mine, you climb the long grade to Dungarroch, the dwarven redoubt that faces the southeast with a jaw set against history. And even quiet, you can hear yesterday's anvil in the walls, a metallic afterimage of vows kept longer than comfort. The ramparts are orderly rather than grand, the courtyard trimmed to the inch, and the hearthstones blackened into the exact shape of fellowship. If a kettle were set on the hook right now, no one would be surprised. You rest a palm against granite that has shrugged off both siege and neglect, and in that cool certainty, you feel why some fortresses become communities even empty. They were built to shelter a future, not just to fend off a past. The sun draws a copper edge along every battlement. The Azurelode's faint runoff chatters below like gossip that has forgiven everyone involved, and you step back onto the road with the simple conviction that work done carefully is a kind of prayer that keeps answering itself. On a bend where hedges have learned to braid themselves, the lane lifts toward South Point Gate, its black stone dressed in banners that refuse to forget, and the battlements watch the coastline with the wary patience that comes from too many lessons learned the hardest way. A little farther up the bluff, South Point Tower stares seawards with a single keen eye, and in its lee, a wayside shrine waits where soldiers and travelers both have been setting their pebbles and coins for longer than any ledger bothered to record. The carved figure is no one in particular, which makes it perfect because anyone can ask a nameless guardian for exactly the help they have, and the brass bell overhead would ring with a kind sound if you drew the cord, though tonight you simply bow and let the wind do the speaking. Down on the tide line, the surf breathes in its measured couplets, while the gate shoulders its history without theatrics, and the narrow stair that knits tower to shore looks like a sentence that learned to be brief only after trying to say too much. You sit on the low wall and watch a patrol pass, boots muted, helms level, and in their disciplined silence you hear the other purpose of fortifications, to remind a country that vigilance can be courteous. When you rise, the shrine flame makes a small, obliging nod in the breeze, and the road widens by a handspan as if to say, "Thank you for using it well." The river insists on teaching its lesson again, and you let it, following a string of modest bridges until a footpath curls toward Brazy's farmstead, where tidy furrows meet an improbable band of sunflowers that hold their yellow like lanterns even when the sky turns thoughtful. The farmhouse porch wears the confidence of a place that has seen too much and chosen humor anyway, and the scarecrow in the corner of the field looks less like a warning to birds than a companion on a long shift. You lean on the rail while the irrigation sluice ticks and murmurs, and the low rush of water through the boards sounds like a patient choir repeating a refrain about enoughness. Enough rain, enough hands, enough seasons to put things right, one bed at a time. On the track back to the ford, your boots darken through, the cold climbing your ankles with the clean grammar of a corrected sentence, and a kingfisher stabs the surface so fast the splash seems late to its own appointment. At the far bank, you pause to watch the wheel turn in its frame, lifting glitter into the trough with each precise revolution, and it occurs to you that the whole farmstead is a wheel of sorts, one that remembers joy on purpose. You shoulder your pack, and the sunflowers tilt as if in agreement. It is hard not to leave with a lighter stride. Evening gathers its warm metals and lays them across the long approach to the Hillsbrad quarry spur, where the chalky cut of earth shines like bone under lacework shadows of alder and ash, and the little switchback that climbs toward the Azurelode spur feels like a thought you have had before and are pleased to think again. Beyond the last rise, the track spills gently toward the Nethander crossroads, that modest X stitched into the countryside where every traveller learns the same lesson in a different order, that a turn is only a choice, and choices are better when made unhurried. A scythe hangs on a nail where the hedgerow thickens, a rake leans into the dusk with a confidence earned one row at a time, and along the verge jars cool under open windows where bread and broth have finished their work and are resting in the knowledge of it. The air tastes faintly of yeast and wood smoke, and the ground answers your steps with the softer consonants of a road that has taken off its armor for the night, and you realize your breath has already matched the cadence of this corner of the world. Off to the south, lantern pricks wink along the line of South Point Gate as the watch changes. To the west, the low shimmer from Laudermere Lake redraws the horizon into a silver certainty, and ahead, the crossroads waits without preference, trusting you to know when to stop and when to go on. You keep walking because the hills have been good company, and because this is a country that keeps its promises, one milestone and one hearth at a time. Dusk closes one drawer and opens another, and lanterns appear along the lanes like a patient constellation drawn closer than the sky. Each flame teaches a small class in scale. This much light is enough for this much place, and enough is a better class of luxury than excess. Windows gather the soft enamel shine of evening talk, and you feel your steps slow to the pace of a story being told around a table where no one has to hurry because the food is finished and the night is kind. On the wharf, the water repeats the lanterns back to themselves, and they seem grateful to be doubled. In the fields, the last birds retire the day with careful signatures. Somewhere a hinge remembers it was oiled, and somewhere else a latch declines to squeal, and the ordinary conspiracy of small kindnesses proceeds in silence. You pass within the edge of light and then out again, and the dark takes you in with the unconditional hospitality of a room prepared before you arrived. You have the sense, briefly, that the hills themselves are tucking you in. Night in Hillsbrad is not empty. It is full of attention that has learned how to be quiet, and the road under your boots proves it with every step. You think of the boots that came before yours, the soldiers who held a line they believed in, the farmers who walked to market in weather that would have argued against it, the smugglers who counted risk by the curve of the moon, the children who dared themselves to go to the third milestone and back. Each left a trace that taught the road a new way to be a road, and it kept them all, because memory is not a burden when it is loved. You run your hand over a milestone whose numbers have been rounded to the point of tenderness by years of rain and fingers, and it feels like shaking hands with time. Stars string themselves over the fields in a measured grammar, and your pace falls into the meter of a lullaby you do not remember learning. If there is a word for the confidence a path can give, it is likely a quiet word, and you let it live in you without asking for its spelling. Somewhere nearby, the river turns a corner and decides to be moonlight for a while. When you finally circle back to the place where you began, the night has polished the foothills to a gleam that has nothing to do with brightness and everything to do with care, and you stand there taking the inventory of what the walk has put back where it belongs. You think of Thoradin's wall and the way it keeps an oath without cruelty, of Southshore and the way ordinary courage can be extraordinary when it is sustained, of Tarren mill and the labor that shapes both boots and lives. You remember Durnholde, which instructs without gloating, and Thrall, whose escape reframed escape as a path toward community rather than an ending. And you remember the sludge fields, where you learned the discipline of looking and the decision not to turn away. You carry Alterac's cold as a caution, and Purgation Isle's wind as a mercy, and you fold the road between Tarren Mill and Southshore into your pocket like a map that has been used enough to be trustworthy. The foothills, for all their softness, are not naive. They are wise the way rivers are, yielding, resilient, decisive when they must be, and always moving toward a larger answer. You breathe in, and the hills breathe with you, as if to say that this companionship was their plan all along. When you finally step off the road, you do not feel that you are leaving. You feel that you have joined something that keeps walking even when you sleep. The last hedgerows of the Hillsbrad Foothills trail away behind you like the fringe on a well-worn cloak, and the road tilts down into a cooler breath where the light grows blue around the edges, as if the day itself has stepped under a canopy and dropped its voice. Pines gather, tall and close, and their resin hangs in the air with a dark, clean sweetness that both soothes and warns, while the wind from the sea threads between the trunks in long, even strands that sound like distant chanting. At your back are Thoradin's wall and the grazing fields and the tidy lanes that remember markets more than patrols. Before you is Silverpine Forest, which remembers patrols more than markets and has trained every bough to hold a secret without complaint. You cross the county line where the ditch deepens and the milepost wears moss like a collar, and the world's palette slips from copper and clover to ash, slate, and evergreen, the way memory changes when you tell it at midnight instead of noon. Ravens mark your arrival with professional indifference and a single judicious rattle of wings, then settle again as if to say that a traveler who listens may pass without tax. You take the hint and match your pace to the hush that this forest insists upon. The first fog rises straight from the leaf litter and sits close to the ground like folded wool, and every footstep inks a brief oval into it that the air erases with polite efficiency, so that your presence becomes an agreement rather than an announcement. Ahead, the border stones squat like old dogs who know the whole story and will not bark unless you force them to. And beyond them, the trees knit tighter, as if they have heard you coming and are already deciding whether you belong. The road draws a long breath and then flattens, and there, shouldering the horizon with the gravity of an oath that outlived its authors, stands the Greymane Wall. It is less a fortification than a verdict, its battlements squared like clenched knuckles, its gates fitted so precisely that even the wind must show its papers before it slips through. Stone the colour of old storms meets stone the colour of colder seas, mortared with the stubborn arithmetic of a nation that once chose solitude over entanglement and paid in quiet coin for the privilege. Every block seems to carry a ledger line of regret under a ledger line of resolve. You trace the lower courses where Ivy has learned the etiquette of siege and climbs only to the second course before bowing out. And you imagine the years when this wall kept Gilneas shut to the world, when the voices on both sides thickened and thinned without ever touching, until rumours grew longer legs than merchants ever did. Stairs climb to a parapet that hums with the organ note of enclosed coast wind, and from there you look back over Silverpine's dark green tide and forward toward that locked grey flank of history, and you feel in your ribs how a boundary can keep harm out and keep healing out in the same motion. To your left, a collapsed sally port reveals the careful bones of the architecture, its ribs splayed like a whale brought to shore for the counting of scars, and the site has the odd decency of blunt honesty. This is what fear looks like when it is well engineered. A watchfire smoulders in a brazier that someone still tends at dusk, the coals briefly sketching a lineage of centuries you will never meet, and for a moment the wall seems less like a symbol and more like a workplace with a very difficult job. When you descend, the gatehouse does not bless or forbid you, but the hinges give a low, thoughtful groan that sounds like permission, and you carry that tone with you as you turn back into the trees. The forest path narrows to a disciplined corridor where bramble and pine have been persuaded, not asked, to stand aside, and lanterns hung at measured intervals mark a rhythm that your feet quickly learn to respect. In the middle distance, a banner stitched with a grief-coloured sigil hangs very still in the windless lane. The timber palisade of the forsaken rearguard rises with the exactness of a diagram solved correctly, each stake blackened at the tip, each platform braced for eyes rather than spectacle, and the whole outpost hums with the quiet arithmetic of those who maintain the rear because there is nothing behind them that may be lost again. Apothecaries work over low braziers whose smoke smells of tannin, juniper, and the sharp, medicinal bite of bitterroot, the steam sketching pale ellipses around their masked faces as they note results in tight, unadorned hands. The alchemy here is defense by means of knowledge, not cruelty, and the distinction hangs in the air like a clarified warning. A sentry at the gate nods you inward with a motion that wastes no kindness and no suspicion. And inside the yard, a rack of oilskin maps gleams like a bookshelf recently consulted and not yet put back in immaculate order. You feel how thoroughly this post has been taught to rehearse, revisit, and revise. Beyond the inner fence, a narrow switchback ushers scouts up to a lookout shelf where the world stacks itself in layers: fog, fur, wall, sea, and an officer traces those layers with a gloved forefinger as if reading braille from the horizon. When you step out again, the gate shuts behind you with a soft, absolute thud, whose resonance you will remember as the sound of a vow kept quietly. And the path westward looks different in its wake, less dangerous for being seen, and more serious for being allowed. Morning here never quite achieves gold. It prefers pewter, and Silverpine forest wears it beautifully, every needle and damp stone submitting to a sheen that turns the ordinary into something ceremonial. The road threads between pillars of spruce and fir that have learned to grow straight even while the ground insists on remembrance. And you notice how the understory prints itself in two colors at once, the steel green of moss and the bruised purple of fallen cones crushed by time and weather, like palimpsest notes left by a meticulous scholar. Somewhere a stream rehearses its argument with a fallen log, and the splash marks glow like small medals where the bark has given way. 3 crows hold a brief committee on a branch that sags under the weight of their attention, then rise in a single, practiced motion that leaves the branch shivering the way the world does after certain truths have been spoken aloud. As you walk, the forest keeps calibrating you, slowing your breath with its humidity, refining your stride to avoid slick roots, teaching your ear the difference between fox-light footfalls and the offbeat clatter of a loose strap against your pack, until your presence becomes not an intrusion, but a variable the place has already solved for. Off the main lane, a side path drifts toward a low wetland where reeds write cursive against the skin of the water and the fog wears spiderwebs like jewelry. The air tastes faintly of iron and bay leaf, and that clean edge tells you the sea is near even when you cannot hear it. By the time the track curls back to the road, you have learned enough of the forest's grammar to know when not to speak, and the silence you choose feels like a correct answer. The path descends into a bowl of earth where slate markers lean like clerks bending over old ledgers, and the lamps along the lane take on a pale, official glow that makes shadows look like annotations. At the far rim, roofs rise with a deliberate lack of sentiment, and together spell the name, the Sepulcher. It is not a crypt in the theatrical sense, but a headquarters for people who have had to build policy where other nations built denial, and its courtyards move with the purposeful hush of a city hall that knows how to keep records of what should never have required recording. Couriers arrive with sealed canisters, quartermasters issue gear that seems designed to outlive its wearer by several campaigns, and apothecaries compare clouded vials under shaded lanterns like accountants cross-checking the decimals that keep a frontier from tipping into void. Everywhere you look, the work of an after-empire proceeds with unspectacular competence. A notice board carries assignments written in a hand that could belong to either the living or the dead, its letters severe but legible, and in that strict clarity you sense a kind of mercy, the refusal to confuse those who are already carrying too much. You take the long outer path between boundary stones and reading lamps, and you overhear one officer telling another that steadiness is a tactic, not a temperament. Then notice how the younger officer straightens as if a weight has been redistributed more fairly across his shoulders. When you finally step through the north gate, the lamps behind you recede into the fog in a series of patient parentheses, and the forest reasserts its authorship. But you carry the Sepulcher's tone forward, the measured cadence of a bureaucracy designed for survival rather than spectacle. The afternoon gathers rain out of nowhere and everywhere at once, a fine, unending script that the needles take down dutifully, and the road turns into a soft slate sentence. You turn toward the coastward lane to make a loop back past the forsaken rear guard, and the outpost receives the weather like an expected report. Oilskins darken on the lines, a brazier hisses once and then steadies, and a runner arrives mud-striped to the knee and hands over a satchel with the reverence of a librarian preserving a first edition in a flood. The captain signs a slate, nods once, and the runner dissolves into the rain with the precision of a comma in the right place. Beyond the palisade, the lane tips toward the sea and then shoulders back inland, and from a low rise you glimpse the ash-grey plains of the Greymane wall again, its crown blurred to a softer geometry by the weather, its will no less visible for being briefly kind. You stand long enough to learn a final lesson Silverpine teaches with cheerful severity, that vigilance and rest are not opposites here, but alternating currents, and a traveler who respects both will not have to pay interest on fear. When you turn for the forest's interior, the ravens return to their business as if your presence has been filed correctly. The fog closes ranks without malice, and the path expresses a quiet clause of welcome that you could miss if you were not listening. By the time the rain steps down to a mist, the pines have polished the day into something you can carry without spilling, and the border stones of Hillsbrad wait ahead, patient as old friends who kept your seat and warmed your cup.